Chapter 1. Into the Frost. The story begins on a bleak, icy morning in early winter, as Jack Dawson, a seasoned survivalist and documentary filmmaker, sets out alone into the Yakutian wilderness. With a sense of both thrill and reverence for nature's harsh beauty, he embarks on his expedition to capture untouched landscapes and the unique isolation that only Siberia's remoteness can offer. Despite years of experience and the many dangers he has survived, there is something about Yakutia that unsettles him. Known for its cold that could turn a man to stone, its haunted tales, and its sparse population, Yakutia is both a land of raw beauty and, to many, a place that holds secrets best left undisturbed. Jack arrives in the last inhabited village, a place where the world feels as though it has stood still for centuries. The locals are reserved and wary, their faces hardened by years of enduring the unforgiving climate. They greet him with cautious hospitality, though many cast furtive glances his way, whispering in low voices about the spirits of the forest. He hears fragments of conversations, warnings about shadows in the snow, the whispering trees, the souls of those lost to the cold. But Jack dismisses their words as superstition, remnants of folklore carried through generations in this isolated place. He secures the last of his provisions and sets out just as the first snow of the season begins to fall, covering the landscape in an endless blanket of white. Jack's path leads him deeper and deeper into the forest, where the silence thickens with each step. The trees grow taller and denser, their branches heavy with frost, casting long skeletal shadows over the snow-covered ground. His breath clouds the air, and he moves with a purposeful stride, his camera in hand, ready to capture the beauty of the wilderness around him. A cold silence. The initial excitement of exploration soon gives way to a strange unease as Jack ventures further into the forest. The air is deathly quiet, thick with a silence so profound that it seems unnatural. Even the usual sounds of a winter forest, rustling branches, the soft crunch of snow underfoot, are absent. There is only the steady rhythm of his own footsteps and the faint sound of his breath, which seems louder in the frozen stillness. He can almost feel the silence pressing in on him, like a weight that grows heavier with every step. Jack tries to shake off the feeling, convincing himself that it's merely the isolation affecting his mind. But the silence persists, deeper and more unsettling than anything he's ever experienced. He begins to feel as if he's being watched, though he knows that no one else could be out here. The sense of unease grows stronger, a faint pulse in the back of his mind that he cannot ignore. He pauses to set up his camera on a tripod, hoping that the simple act of focusing on his craft will calm his nerves. The lens captures the endless expanse of white, the towering trees, the skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like fingers clawing their way out of the earth. He adjusts the focus, and as he peers through the viewfinder, he notices something strange. A faint, dark shape in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. He blinks, and the shape is gone, as if it were never there. Just a trick of the light, he tells himself. The mind can play strange tricks in a place like this, especially when surrounded by so much silence. Encounters with the unseen. As the day wears on, Jack pushes deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that winds between ancient pines and snow-laden firs. The temperature drops steadily, and soon the cold is so intense that even his thick, fur-lined coat offers little protection. He begins to feel the bite of the frost on his face, his fingers numbing despite his gloves. But it's not just the cold that chills him. There's an oppressive feeling in the air, a sense that something lies hidden just beyond his sight. He begins to notice strange signs, small disturbances in the snow, patches of ground where the snow has been disturbed, as if something heavy had moved through here recently. The markings are irregular, almost haphazard, and he can't make out any clear footprints. It's as if something had been dragging itself along the ground, leaving faint trails that disappear into the shadows between the trees. Jack stops to examine one of these patches, kneeling down to get a closer look. The snow is disturbed, the surface uneven, but there are no clear prints, no indication of what might have caused it. He takes a few photographs, documenting the strange patterns, though he can't shake the feeling that something is watching him from the shadows. As he rises to his feet, he feels a sudden chill run down his spine. and he turns quickly, his eyes scanning the trees. But there is nothing there. Only the silent forest, the dark shapes of the trees standing like sentinels in the snow. Strange symbols. As dusk approaches, Jack decides to make camp for the night. He finds a small clearing sheltered by a ring of trees and begins to set up his tent. As he works, he notices strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees surrounding him. Crude shapes, almost like runes, etched deep into the wood. The carvings are old, the edges worn and weathered, but they are unmistakably man-made. The symbols seem to form a pattern, a strange, spiraling design that makes him feel dizzy just looking at it. He tries to decipher their meaning, but they are unlike anything he's seen before. He takes a few photos, making a mental note to research the symbols once he returns to civilization. As he sets up his campfire and prepares a simple meal, he can't shake the feeling that the symbols are watching him, as if they hold some ancient power that lingers in the air. He eats quickly, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight, his mind racing with questions. Who carved these symbols? And why? What purpose could they serve here in the heart of the wilderness? The first night falls quickly in the Yakutian wilderness, and soon Jack is surrounded by a darkness so complete that even his campfire seems feeble against it. The silence is even more intense now, a heavy, almost oppressive stillness that fills the air like a weight. He sits by the fire, listening to the faint crackling of the flames, the only sound in the vast empty forest. As he stares into the fire, he begins to hear faint sounds in the distance, soft whispers that seem to come from the shadows beyond the light. He can't make out any words, only the tone, a low murmuring sound that sends a chill down his spine. He tells himself it's just the wind, but deep down, he knows that's not true. The whispers are too deliberate, too precise, as if someone, or something, is speaking just out of earshot, their words lost in the darkness. He tries to ignore it, focusing on the fire, but the whispers grow louder, filling his mind with a sense of dread that he can't shake. Finally, he retreats into his tent, zipping the flap tightly and pulling his sleeping bag around him for warmth. But even inside the tent, he can still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, as if they are coming from within his own mind. He lies awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, his heart pounding, until finally, exhaustion overtakes him, and he drifts into a restless sleep. Dreams of shadows. His dreams are filled with strange, distorted images. Dark shapes moving through the trees. Shadowy figures that seem to melt into the forest, their faces obscured, their eyes hollow and empty. He hears voices in his dreams, low and murmuring, calling his name in a soft, haunting whisper. In one dream, he finds himself standing in the clearing, surrounded by the symbols carved into the trees. The symbols glow with a faint, eerie light, casting strange shadows that dance across the snow. He feels a presence behind him, a cold, heavy weight that presses down on him, filling him with a sense of terror so intense that he can't move. He tries to turn, to face whatever is behind him, but he is frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows close in around him, the darkness growing deeper and more oppressive, until he feels as though he is drowning in it. The whispers grow louder, filling his mind, and he wakes with a start, his heart racing, his body drenched in cold sweat. He sits up in his tent, gasping for breath, the memory of the dream lingering in his mind like a shadow. The night is still, the air heavy with silence, but he can't shake the feeling that something is watching him from the darkness just beyond the tent. Morning comes, but the shadows remain. When morning finally arrives, Jack emerges from his tent, feeling more exhausted than refreshed. The forest is bathed in pale, cold light, the snow glittering in the early sun, but the beauty of the landscape does nothing to ease the unease that lingers within him. He packs up his camp, checking his equipment and supplies, but he can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. The strange symbols, the disturbed snow, the whispers in the night, all of it feels like a warning, a sign that he has ventured into a place that does not welcome him. As he continues his journey deeper into the forest, he becomes acutely aware of the silence around him. There are no birds, no animals, no sounds of life, only the soft crunch of his footsteps in the snow. the quiet rustle of his coat as he moves. The forest feels different now, as if it has taken on a life of its own, a presence that watches him from every shadow, every tree. He can feel its eyes on him, a cold, indifferent gaze that seems to follow his every move. A haunting realization. By midday, Jack realizes he has been walking in circles. No matter which direction he chooses, he keeps finding himself back at the same clearing, surrounded by the same trees, the same symbols carved into the bark. It's as if the forest itself is guiding him, leading him back to this place, trapping him in a loop that he cannot escape. He tries to keep his composure, but a growing sense of dread fills him. The forest is not just a place. It is something alive, something aware, a presence that seems to pulse with a dark, ancient energy. He is no longer an explorer documenting the wilderness. He is a trespasser, an intruder in a realm that does not belong to him. As the day wears on, the shadows grow longer, the air colder, and Jack feels himself slipping into a strange, dreamlike state. His thoughts blur, his mind clouded by exhaustion and fear, and he begins to question his own reality. The line between dream and waking life becomes thin, as if the forest is weaving its way into his mind, drawing him deeper into its shadowed depths. As night falls once again, Jack knows that he cannot escape. He is trapped, lost in a place that defies reason, a place where shadows come alive, and the whispers of the past linger in the air. And as he sets up camp once more, the realization settles over him like a shroud. He is no longer the master of his journey. The forest has taken control, guiding him into its heart, into the shadows, into the unknown. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. And the night closed in around Jack, settling like a suffocating shroud, the darkness so absolute it was as if the forest had devoured the light. Inside his tent, he huddled against the cold, desperately trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered from the day. The Yakutian forest, once a wilderness he'd planned to conquer, had transformed into a place he no longer recognized. As the night wore on, his senses sharpened. Every creak, every soft crunch of snow outside his tent, amplified against the deafening silence. He tried to rationalize the strange occurrences, the symbols carved into the trees, the strange patterns in the snow, and the eerie, creeping sensation of being watched. But alone in the heart of a desolate forest, logic felt thin, like a fragile layer of frost that could shatter under the weight of whatever ancient secrets lurked in these trees. At first, there was only silence. Then, in the deepest part of the night, it began. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a faint whisper, distant and ghostly, like a breeze that carried words he could almost understand. Jack sat up, heart pounding as he strained to listen, trying to catch the words that seemed to drift through the fabric of his tent. Jack! His name, faint and distorted, barely more than a murmur, but unmistakable. His skin prickled as he held his breath, waiting, his heart hammering as he tried to convince himself it was just the wind. But then it came again, closer this time, as though whispered just outside his tent. Come back! Jack! His instincts screamed at him to stay inside, but the urge to see, to know what or who was out there, overpowered his fear. He unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside, his breath clouding the frigid air. The forest was still, blanketed in snow, the trees casting long shadows under the faint glow of the moon. But there was no one there. Yet the voice persisted, a soft, mournful call that seemed to wrap around him, filling the silence with its eerie resonance. The da-teum, the unearthly laughter. He stepped out of his tent, wrapped tightly in his coat, flashlight gripped in one hand as he scanned the shadows around him. Every beam of light seemed swallowed by the darkness, revealing nothing but the silent, unmoving trees. He walked a few paces away from the tent, his footsteps muffled by the thick snow. The forest loomed around him, a wall of dark branches and thick trunks, casting twisted shadows that seemed to shift and writhe under the light. Then he heard it, a faint, chilling sound that raised every hair on his body. Laughter, soft and mocking, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. It was distant, yet he could feel it surrounding him, closing in, an insidious presence that seemed to toy with him, daring him to venture deeper. The laughter grew louder, resonating through the forest. The sound distorted, as though it came from a multitude of voices blending together in a chaotic symphony. It was not the laughter of joy, but something twisted and unnatural, a sound that held no warmth, only malice. "Who's there?" he called, his voice thin against the oppressive silence that followed. But the only answer was the soft crunch of his own footsteps and the eerie, lingering echo of laughter fading into the depths of the forest. Frosted shadows. He returned to his tent, his mind reeling, and closed the flap as though it could shield him from the darkness pressing in on all sides. But even within the confines of his shelter, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Every so often, he thought he saw shadows moving across the thin fabric of the tent, dark shapes flitting past in silence. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory of the laughter, the whispers returned, filling his mind with images he could not escape. The faces of the villagers, their whispered warnings about spirits in the forest, haunted him. He'd dismissed their words as superstition, a story to scare outsiders. But now, with the weight of night pressing down on him, those tales felt all too real. Hours passed in a blur of anxious waiting, until finally, exhaustion overtook him, and he slipped into a restless sleep. In his dreams, he was running, his breath clouding the air as he stumbled through the snow, the shadows around him growing thicker, darker, as though they were alive. The whispers followed him, voices calling his name, laughter echoing in the distance, and a chilling, unshakable feeling that he was being hunted. He awoke with a start, his heart racing, his mind a whirl of fear and confusion. But as he lay there, his breath slowing, he realized that something had changed. The whispers were no longer in his dreams. They were here, real and present, a faint murmur that drifted through the stillness of the forest. Seemed some disturbing signs. When morning came, it brought no comfort. The forest was still and silent, the air thick with an unnatural calm that filled him with dread. He packed up his gear quickly, wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever haunted the night. As he moved through the forest, he began to notice strange signs in the snow, footprints that didn't match his own, tracks that appeared to circle around his camp before disappearing into the trees. The prints were faint, distorted, but they seemed almost human, as though someone had been walking barefoot through the snow. The symbols carved into the trees appeared again, more frequent now, their crude shapes standing out against the rough bark. Each one felt like a warning, a silent message that he could not decipher, yet could not ignore. The symbols seemed to follow him, their presence growing stronger, more insistent, as if guiding him towards something hidden deep within the forest. He tried to ignore them, focusing on his path, but his mind kept drifting back to the laughter, the whispers, the sense of being watched. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware, its dark heart beating just beneath the surface, drawing him in with each step. Trapped in time. Hours passed as he walked, the cold seeping into his bones, his mind growing hazy with exhaustion. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a maze of twisted trees and snow-covered ground, and he began to feel as though he were walking in circles, retracing his own steps over and over again. At one point, he came across a small clearing, a place where the trees opened up to reveal a patch of untouched snow. But as he stepped into the clearing, he realized with a start that he had been here before. He recognized the pattern of branches, the symbols carved into the trees. Somehow, despite his careful navigation, he had returned to the same spot he had passed hours ago. A sense of panic gripped him as he stared at the symbols, their meaning elusive but filled with an ominous power. He felt trapped, caught in a loop that he could not escape, as though the forest itself were bending time, warping his path to keep him within its grasp. He marked a nearby tree with his knife, a deep slash in the bark to signal his presence. Then he set off again, determined to find a way out. But no matter which direction he chose, he found himself back in the same clearing, standing before the same marked tree, the same silent shadows surrounding him. The whispers returned, faint and mocking, a soft murmur that seemed to come from all directions. His heart pounded as he turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. but the voices remained elusive, drifting through the air like smoke. "Jack," they whispered, the sound lingering in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread that was both familiar and foreign. It was as if the voices were calling to a part of him that he didn't recognize, a part of himself that had been buried in the shadows of the forest. Unseen presence. By the time night fell, Jack had accepted that he was lost. No amount of logic or reason could explain the strange occurrences, the endless circles, the whispers that seemed to haunt his every step. He was no longer alone in this forest. Something was here with him, something that moved unseen through the shadows, watching, waiting. He set up his tent once more, his mind reeling with exhaustion, his body aching from the cold. The darkness seemed thicker than ever, an oppressive weight that pressed down on him, filling the air with a silence so absolute that even his own breathing seemed loud. As he lay in his sleeping bag, trying to block out the fear that gnawed at him, he heard it again, the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow, just outside his tent. He held his breath, his heart pounding as the footsteps grew closer, circling the tent in slow, deliberate movements. He reached for his flashlight, gripping it tightly as he tried to convince himself it was just an animal, perhaps a fox or a stray deer. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The steps were too measured, too intentional, each one a careful, calculated sound that seemed to echo through the stillness. He turned on the flashlight, the beam piercing through the darkness, casting a circle of light on the tent walls. But as he scanned the area, he saw nothing. Only the soft outlines of trees, their shadows stretching across the snow like dark fingers reaching toward him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but Jack could still feel the presence, a cold, unyielding awareness that lingered just beyond the edge of the light. The voice inside. He lay awake for hours, his mind racing, his body tense, waiting for the footsteps to return. But the night remained silent, the forest cloaked in an eerie stillness that felt more oppressive with each passing minute. As dawn approached, he closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he heard the voice again, this time closer, a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to come from within his own mind. "Come back, Jack. Come back to us." The voice was low, almost soothing, but it filled him with a sense of dread that he could not ignore. It was as if the forest itself were calling to him, reaching out with invisible hands to draw him into its depths. He woke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat, his mind filled with the memory of the voice, the laughter, the footsteps in the snow. He was no longer alone in this place. The forest had claimed him, and he knew that he could not escape its grasp. As he packed up his camp, his hands shaking, he realized that he was trapped in a place that defied reason, a place where shadows came alive, and the whispers of the past lingered in the air like a haunting melody. He didn't know what awaited him in the depths of the forest, but he knew one thing with chilling certainty. He was no longer the master of his own fate. The forest had taken control, guiding him into its heart, into the shadows, into the unknown. And as he set off once more, his heart pounding, his mind filled with fear, he could feel the eyes of the forest watching him, waiting, drawing him deeper into the darkness that lay beyond the trees. Chapter 3. The Cabin in the Woods. Jack Dawson trudged through the snow, his steps heavy, his mind clouded with exhaustion and fear. The strange occurrences of the past few nights had left him shaken. Footsteps circling his tent, whispers calling his name, and the disorienting loops that kept bringing him back to the same clearing. The forest felt alive, as though it had a mind of its own, a dark intelligence that watched him, toyed with him. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into the heart of something ancient, something malevolent. It was midday when he first saw the cabin. Hidden among the trees, it seemed to rise out of the snow, its silhouette dark and looming, almost as though it had been waiting for him. He froze, heart pounding as he took in the sight. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and warped, the roof sagging under the weight of years of snow and neglect. There were no signs of life, no smoke rising from a chimney, no footprints in the snow around it, just a desolate, abandoned structure standing silent and still. Jack felt an inexplicable pull toward the cabin, a strange compulsion that overrode his better judgment. Despite the fear that churned in his gut, he found himself moving toward it, as if drawn by an invisible thread. A relic of the past. The closer he got, the more unsettling details he noticed. The wood was dark, almost blackened, as though it had been scorched by fire long ago, yet there were no signs of recent damage. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, crude shapes that seemed to form a pattern, spiraling and twisting, their lines worn and faded with age. He reached out, tracing one of the symbols with his gloved hand. The wood felt cold, unnaturally so, as though it had absorbed the chill of the forest and held it within itself. A shiver ran down his spine as he pulled his hand away, wiping it against his coat, as though trying to rid himself of an invisible stain. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the rusted latch. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place behind and never look back. But something deeper, something primal, urged him forward. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Inside the cabin, the air inside was thick, stale, filled with the scent of rot and decay. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by his entrance, swirling in the faint light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The cabin was small, its interior cramped and shadowed, with only a single room that held the remnants of a life long abandoned. An old broken table sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in dust and the remnants of rotting food. A rusted pot lay on its side, its contents a dried, mouldy mess that had long since decayed into an unrecognizable sludge. There was a narrow bed against one wall, its frame warped and sagging, the mattress little more than a pile of rags and straw. But it was the walls that caught his attention. They were covered in writing, words scratched into the wood in a haphazard, frantic scrawl. Some of the writing was barely legible, faded with time, while other parts were fresh, the marks deep and dark as though carved in recent desperation. Jack moved closer, squinting in the dim light as he tried to make out the words. The sentences were fragmented, disjointed, filled with words that spoke of fear and despair. It watches. I can feel it. Can't leave. Shadows in the trees. They know my name. The words seemed to spiral around the room, forming a chaotic pattern that drew his eyes along the walls, twisting and turning until his head spun. The journal. On the broken table, Jack noticed a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and faded, the edges frayed as though it had been handled countless times. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before picking it up, the leather rough against his gloved fingers. He opened the journal, flipping through the pages. The writing was frantic, the words scrawled in a messy, hurried hand. The entries were dated, each one a testament to the writer's slow descent into madness. Day 1. The cabin seems safe enough. The forest is quiet, too quiet. Day 3. I heard something outside last night. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. I know I'm alone here, but it sounded like someone was circling the cabin. Day 5. The whispers are getting louder. They call my name, taunting me. I try to ignore them, but they're in my head now, echoing through the silence. Day 8. I tried to leave, walked in a straight line, marking the trees as I went. But I ended up back at the cabin, no matter which way I went. The forest won't let me go. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he read, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. The final entry was short, a single line scrawled in shaky letters. It's here. I can feel it watching me. I don't think I'll survive the night. The journal ended there, the rest of the pages blank, silent witnesses to whatever fate had befallen the writer. The strange mirror. On the wall opposite the bed hung a small, cracked mirror. Its surface was covered in grime, the glass warped and cloudy, distorting any reflection. Jack approached it, feeling an inexplicable urge to see his own face, to confirm that he was still himself, that he hadn't been changed by the forest. He wiped away a patch of dust, peering into the mirror. His face stared back at him, pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But as he watched, something flickered in the background. A shadowy figure, barely visible, standing just behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, silent, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He turned back to the mirror, his pulse pounding in his ears, but the figure was gone. Only his own reflection remained, staring back at him with a haunted expression that he barely recognized. The night in the cabin. As night fell, Jack had no choice but to stay in the cabin. The temperature had dropped drastically, and a fierce wind howled outside, rattling the walls and filling the air with the sound of groaning wood. The fire he managed to start in the small stone fireplace did little to warm the room, its flames weak and flickering, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. He huddled near the fire, clutching the journal in his hands, the words replaying in his mind, each entry a reminder of the isolation, the fear that had consumed the previous occupant. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to pulse in the firelight, their shapes shifting, almost alive, as though they held a power that lay dormant, waiting. As the hours passed, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive, filling the cabin with a tension that made his skin crawl. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around him, as though the trees themselves were watching, their roots entwined with the ancient secrets buried in the soil. And then the whispers began, voices in the dark. The sound was faint at first, barely more than a murmur, a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to drift through the walls. Jack froze, his heart pounding as he listened, straining to make out the words. "Jack, come back." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it was filled with an unnatural edge, a note of malice that made his blood run cold. He gripped the journal tighter, feeling the weight of the cabin close in around him, the darkness pressing against the thin walls, seeping through the cracks. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their soft, insistent call. He felt as though he were surrounded, as though unseen figures stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, their voices blending together in a haunting chorus that echoed through the silence. He tried to block out the sound, covering his ears, but the whispers seemed to come from within his own mind, an inescapable presence that wormed its way into his thoughts, filling his mind with dark, unsettling images. The apparition. Just as he thought he could bear it no longer, the whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. He lowered his hands, his pulse racing, his eyes scanning the shadows that filled the room. And then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible in the faint glow of the fire. It was tall and thin, its body twisted, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face was hidden in shadow, but he could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but his voice caught in his throat, fear paralyzing him as the figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step filling the air with a heavy, oppressive silence. It stopped just a few feet away, its shadow falling over him like a shroud. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "You cannot escape." The words echoed in his mind, a chilling promise that filled him with a sense of dread so profound that he felt as though he were sinking into the floor, the weight of the cabin pressing down on him, trapping him in a darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. The final hours. The figure faded as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Jack alone in the dim, flickering light of the fire. The whispers returned, softer now, their tone almost soothing, like a lullaby that lulled him into a state of numbness, of acceptance. He knew he would not survive the night. The forest had claimed him, drawn him into its depths, and now it would keep him here, a silent witness to whatever ancient, unknowable force lurked within its shadows. As dawn approached, he felt himself drifting, his mind slipping into a hazy, dreamlike state. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the cracked mirror, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with the same haunted look he had seen in the journal's final entry. And then, as the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, the whispers faded, leaving only silence, a silence that would remain, waiting, until the next soul ventured into the heart of the Yakutian forest. Chapter 4. A Visitor in the Night. Morning brought no relief. Jack Dawson awoke in the silent cabin, his breath visible in the frigid air. The events of the previous night haunted him, The voices in the shadows. The figure that had stood over him, whispering words of despair. He sat up slowly, feeling as if the weight of the entire forest had settled onto his shoulders. The light filtering through the cracked walls cast ghostly patterns on the floor, reminding him of the twisted symbols etched into the wood. Everything about the cabin felt wrong, as though it were a living thing that had absorbed years of fear and despair, waiting patiently for him to add his own story to its twisted history. Jack's mind raced as he recalled the journal he'd found, its pages filled with frantic warnings. The entries had painted a portrait of a man losing his grip on reality, consumed by an unseen force that drove him to the brink of madness. But Jack refused to believe he was at that point yet. He had come prepared, equipped with knowledge, skill, and a clear mind, or so he thought. He gathered his supplies and set off, hoping to put distance between himself and the cursed cabin. But as he stepped outside, he felt the forest's cold grip tighten around him, a chilling reminder that no distance could protect him from the forces lurking in the Yakutian wilderness. The unyielding cold hours passed as Jack trudged through the endless forest, the silence thick and oppressive. Snow blanketed the ground in an unbroken expanse of white, stretching out as far as he could see, while the skeletal trees loomed over him, their dark branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The cold bit into his skin, each breath a plume of mist that hung in the still air. The weight of isolation pressed down on him, the silence amplifying his own heartbeat. The strange symbols he had seen on the trees earlier now seemed to follow him, appearing in places they hadn't been before. No matter which direction he took, they greeted him, their crude shapes twisted into patterns that defied any logic or sense. He felt like he was being drawn deeper into a maze, each step a thread pulling him into the heart of some dark design. And then, in the distance, he heard it. A faint sound, almost like a song. A melody so soft that it seemed to blend with the wind. It was haunting, filled with a melancholy that sent a shiver down his spine. The sound seemed to come from all around him, impossible to locate. But despite his fear, he found himself moving toward it, unable to resist its pull. Varolfai harned the return to the cabin. He had walked for hours, determined to leave the cabin behind, but no matter which path he took, he kept finding himself back at its entrance. The forest was playing tricks on him, warping time and space, trapping him in a loop that he couldn't escape. The melody had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt like a warning. Reluctantly, Jack pushed open the cabin door and stepped back inside, the familiar scent of decay filling his lungs. The interior looked exactly as he had left it, but there was a new tension in the air, a sense of something watching him, waiting. He lit a small fire in the stone fireplace and sat down, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. He knew he couldn't let his guard down, not in this place, but his mind was fogged with fatigue, and his body ached from the cold. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag and settled down by the fire, hoping for a few hours of rest. The silence pressed in on him, thick and stifling, and he found himself listening for any sound, any sign that he was truly alone. But the forest outside was quiet, the trees standing sentinel in the dark, casting long shadows that crept toward the cabin like silent specters. The footsteps in the snow. Sometime in the night, Jack awoke to a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic crunching that echoed through the silence. His heart pounded as he lay still, listening, his mind racing with fear. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow just outside the cabin. He sat up, every nerve on edge as he strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the door. He felt the weight of the cabin walls around him, as if they were shrinking, trapping him in a space that felt smaller and darker with each passing second. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. But then, a soft knock echoed through the cabin, filling the air with a dread that made his blood run cold. He didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping that whatever was outside would lose interest and leave. But the knock came again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. He reached for his flashlight, clutching it tightly as he forced himself to stand. He took a step toward the door, his legs trembling, his mind screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything but open it. But some part of him, a part he didn't recognize, urged him forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. With a shaking hand, he grasped the latch and pulled the door open. Forgive the shadowed visitor. The figure standing in the doorway was tall and shrouded in darkness, its face obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to it, hiding its features in a veil of night. It was dressed in clothes that looked old, worn and tattered, as if they had been left in the forest for years, exposed to the elements. Its posture was stiff, unnatural, as though it were held together by something other than flesh and bone. Jack's voice caught in his throat as he tried to speak, to ask who or what this figure was. But the words died on his lips as the figure raised its head, and he saw its eyes, empty, hollow, filled with a darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and Jack stumbled back, his flashlight casting a feeble glow that barely illuminated the room. The figure's presence filled the cabin, its shadow stretching across the walls, consuming the light, turning everything into shades of black and grey. And then, in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves, it spoke. "You have come to join us." The words echoed through the cabin, filling the air with a sense of finality, as though it were a sentence handed down by some ancient unseen force. Jack shook his head, his mind reeling with fear, but the figure moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him, unblinking, unrelenting. A desperate escape. In a burst of panic, Jack turned and ran, his mind clouded by terror. He pushed past the figure, feeling its cold presence brush against him like a gust of winter air. He stumbled out into the snow, his breath coming in frantic gasps as he sprinted through the trees, his footsteps echoing in the silent forest. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get as far from the cabin as possible. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the trees looming over him like silent watchers, their branches reaching out as if to grab him, to pull him back into the darkness. The whispers returned, filling the air with their haunting melody, their voices blending together in a symphony of despair. He could hear them calling his name, each syllable a dagger of fear that drove him deeper into the forest, away from any semblance of safety. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. He could feel the presence of the figure behind him, a dark shadow that pursued him relentlessly, its eyes boring into his back, a cold reminder that he could not escape the forest's grip. A circle of shadows. As he ran, he noticed something strange. The trees around him began to look familiar, their twisted branches and the symbols carved into their trunks, a chilling reminder of where he was. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had been here before. Somehow, he had returned to the same clearing, the same spot where he had first encountered the strange symbols in the snow. The forest had brought him back, guiding him in circles, trapping him in a place where escape was impossible. He looked around, his breath visible in the cold air, the shadows closing in as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with an eerie, mocking tone. He was surrounded, encircled by the very trees that had seemed to watch him from the start. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that moved and shifted, their forms barely visible in the darkness. He felt as though he were standing in the center of an audience, the forest itself a dark, sentient presence that waited, watching his every move. And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from somewhere in the shadows. It was not human, but something older, something that had lived in the forest long before he had ever set foot in it. The growl resonated through the clearing, filling the air with a sense of primal terror that froze him in place. The hunter. Out of the shadows, a new figure emerged, larger, more menacing than the one he had seen at the cabin. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its form shifting and changing as though it were made of the very darkness that surrounded it. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin points of light that pierced the shadows, focused on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The creature circled him, its movements slow and calculated, as though savoring the fear that radiated from him. He could feel its gaze, a cold, unfeeling stare that seemed to see straight through him, as if it were looking at his very soul. He backed away, his body trembling, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The creature continued to circle him, its eyes never leaving him, its growl a constant low rumble that filled the air. Why are you doing this?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the darkness. But there was no answer. Only the creature's eyes, watching him, waiting, as though it were savoring the moment, the fear, the despair that filled him. The embrace of the shadows. As the creature drew closer, he felt an overwhelming sense of surrender, a dark acceptance that filled him with a strange, haunting peace. He knew that he could not escape, that the forest had claimed him, and that he was now a part of its ancient, unyielding presence. The whispers softened, becoming almost gentle, like a lullaby that wrapped around him, lulling him into a state of numbness. He could feel the shadows closing in, their cold embrace pulling him into their depths, a final, inescapable descent into the heart of the forest. And as the darkness consumed him, he felt a strange sense of belonging, a quiet understanding that he had found his place, his role in the endless cycle of the Yakutian wilderness. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. The forest would continue, its secrets buried in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander into its depths, to join the whispers, the shadows, the ancient presence that watched from beyond. The night closed in, and Jack was gone, leaving only silence, a silence that would linger, haunting, eternal, until the forest claimed its next victim. Chapter 5: Signs of the Lost. When Jack awoke, the morning sky was shrouded in a hazy grey light that barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees. The forest around him was unnervingly quiet, and a deep chill had settled into his bones. His breaths emerged as faint clouds in the frigid air, lingering longer than they should before vanishing, as if even the mist itself was reluctant to leave this cursed place. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on him. Footsteps in the snow, the whispers that crept into his mind, and the shadowed figure in the doorway of the cabin. Everything had begun to blur together, a nightmarish reel that left him questioning where reality ended and something darker began. His pulse quickened as he scanned the woods around him, every rustling leaf and bending branch making him think he was not alone. And then he noticed it. The strange footprints leading away from his campsite, winding off in a direction he hadn't noticed before. They were faint, almost ghostly in the snow, as if left by someone walking on the edge of existence. The sight of them filled him with both dread and a faint glimmer of hope, like the remnants of a path left by someone who had come before. Fabs raised in a maze of footprints. As Jack followed the tracks, he saw more of them, crisscrossing one another in a chaotic web that suggested desperation, as though the people who'd left them had been searching frantically for a way out. Some of the prints were shallow, suggesting someone light-footed, perhaps a child. Others were deep, as if the person who had left them was weighed down by something heavy. What frightened Jack the most was the way the prints seemed to loop back onto themselves, as if those who'd left them had been pulled in circles by some unseen force. The sense of dread thickened with each step, the silence around him growing more oppressive. He came across small signs that hinted at lives once lived. A scarf partially buried in the snow, torn and faded, flapping gently in the breeze. A cracked thermos lying on its side, its contents long since emptied, frozen to the inside. And then he found something that made his heart skip a beat. A tiny doll, half buried in the snow, its porcelain face chipped, its dress stiff with ice. He picked it up, his hand shaking, and stared at it in horror. The doll's empty eyes seemed to stare back at him, as if to warn him of the fate that awaited him if he continued deeper into the forest. He dropped the doll, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him, and continued forward, each step heavier than the last. The scattered belongings told a story of people who had ventured into the forest just as he had, only to vanish, leaving behind fragments of themselves. He couldn't help but wonder what had drawn them here, what had compelled them to leave their belongings behind as they descended into madness. Fats, the forgotten campsite. After hours of walking, Jack came upon an abandoned campsite. The tent was tattered, its fabric worn thin by the elements, and the snow around it was disturbed, as if someone had struggled here. Empty cans and scattered supplies lay strewn about, half buried in the snow. He knelt down and picked up a notebook lying in the snow, the pages stiff with frost. Flipping through the notebook, he saw entries scrawled in a shaky hand. The ink faded, but still legible. The writer's words grew increasingly frantic with each page, their thoughts descending into paranoia and fear. Day 5. The forest won't let me go. I tried to leave today, but every path leads me back to the same spot. I can hear them now, the whispers. They know my name. They're calling to me, telling me to join them. Day 8. I found another camp today, but there was no one there, just empty tents and the remains of a fire. It's as if the forest swallowed them whole. Day 12. I'm not alone here. There are others, but they're not human anymore. I can see them out of the corner of my eye, just shadows moving in the trees. I know they're watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The final page was little more than a frantic scrawl, the words barely legible. If anyone finds this, turn back. Don't listen to the voices. They're lies. Lies! Jack closed the notebook, his hands shaking as he slipped it into his pocket. The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of foreboding. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching him from the shadows, but there was only the empty silence, the trees standing tall and unmoving, as if bearing witness to his fear. Maunti am the path of the desperate. As he left the campsite, Jack noticed the footprints once more, leading deeper into the forest. They were different now, more erratic, as though the person who'd left them had been running, stumbling through the snow in a desperate attempt to escape. He followed them, his own fear mounting with each step. The forest seemed to grow darker, the trees pressing in on him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a faint, sickly sweet smell that made his stomach turn. The further he went, the more the footprints changed. They became deeper, as though the person had fallen and crawled through the snow, leaving long, ragged trails that wound through the trees. He could almost hear their ragged breaths, their desperate cries for help that had gone unanswered. Then, to his horror, the footprints stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest what had happened to them. It was as if they had simply been swallowed by the forest, their existence erased. Jack stood there, staring at the spot where the footprints ended, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a darkness that stretched out beyond his comprehension. Echoes in the snow. As he turned to leave, he heard something, a faint sound, barely more than a whisper, carried on the wind. It was a voice, soft and haunting, calling his name. Jack! He froze, his blood turning to ice as he listened. The voice was distant, almost ethereal, but there was a familiarity to it that made his heart ache. It sounded like someone he knew, someone he had long since forgotten. Jack, come back! The words were like a spell, drawing him forward, compelling him to follow. He took a step toward the sound, his mind fogged with a strange sense of longing. He felt as though he were being pulled into a dream, a place where time and reality had no meaning. But then, in a moment of clarity, he realized what was happening. The forest was trying to lure him, to ensnare him in its web, just as it had done to the others. He shook his head, forcing himself to turn away, to break free from the voice's hold. The whispers faded, but the sense of loss lingered, a hollow ache that settled deep within him. He knew he had narrowly escaped the forest's grasp, but he also knew that it would not give up so easily. Signs of struggle. Further along, he came across more signs, marks in the snow, scratches on the trees, symbols etched into the bark. They were crude, hastily drawn, but they spoke of desperation, of someone trying to leave a message, a warning. One symbol in particular caught his eye, a circle with a line through it, carved deep into the bark of a tree. It was a symbol he recognized from folklore, a mark meant to ward off evil spirits. He had seen it before in the villages near the edge of the forest, drawn on doors and windows, a talisman to keep the darkness at bay. But here, in the heart of the forest, the symbol seemed powerless, a futile gesture against the ancient force that lurked within. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that these marks, these signs of resistance, had done nothing to protect those who had come before him. The forest had claimed them all, and it would claim him too, if he let his guard down. A final warning. As night began to fall, Jack stumbled upon a small clearing where the snow was disturbed, scattered in a wide circle. At the center of the circle lay a crude altar, made of rocks and branches, covered in a thin layer of frost. On the altar lay a piece of paper, torn and weathered, the ink smeared and faded. He picked it up, his heart pounding as he read the words scrawled across the page. They come in the night, shadows that walk between the trees. They call to you, promising answers, but they are lies. Turn back now, before it's too late. The message was barely legible, the letters scratched into the paper with a trembling hand. Jack could almost feel the fear that had driven the writer, the desperation that had forced them to leave this warning for anyone who might follow. But even as he read the words, he knew it was too late for him. The forest had already claimed him, drawn him into its depths, and he could feel its presence around him, a dark, unyielding force that watched and waited. The return of the shadows. As night fell, the whispers returned, filling the air with their haunting melody. Jack felt his heart race as he listened, the voices blending together in a chorus of despair, each one calling his name, begging him to join them. Jack, come to us. The shadows deepened, closing in around him, and he felt a strange, almost irresistible pull toward the darkness. The voices were soft, mournful, but there was a malice hidden beneath their sweetness, a hunger that filled him with dread. He tried to resist, to hold on to his sanity, but the voices grew louder, their words seeping into his mind, filling him with a sense of inevitability. He knew, deep down, that he was already lost, that the forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those who had come before. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the faint outline of footprints in the snow, leading deeper into the forest, a path that stretched out into the endless shadows. And as he took his final step, he knew that he was not alone, that he was one of the lost, another soul swallowed by the silence of the Yakutian wilderness. Chapter 6. Lost Time. When Jack opened his eyes, the world was an endless grey. The cold seeped into his bones, a chill that was deeper than anything he'd ever felt. His surroundings were indistinct, as though the snow-covered trees and forest floor were part of a half-formed dream. His thoughts felt heavy, slow, as if trapped in some thick fog that he couldn't shake off. His sense of time was slipping. He wasn't sure how long he had been wandering, or if he had slept at all. It felt like he had drifted through days and nights without end, lost in a place where time no longer had meaning. The forest was silent around him, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if even the smallest sound would be swallowed up by the snow and the shadows. Jack checked his watch, but the screen was dark, dead, the hands frozen in place. He frowned, hitting it against his palm, but nothing changed. It was as if time itself had stopped in this place, leaving him trapped in an eternal moment. The footprints he had been following had vanished overnight, erased by fresh snow that fell thick and relentless. His tracks too had disappeared, leaving no trace of where he'd come from or where he was going. The landscape around him was featureless, an endless sea of white and grey that stretched out in every direction, blurring the line between earth and sky. But the pull of the whispers. As he walked, he heard the whispers again, faint and distant, carried on a cold breeze that cut through the trees. The voices were soft, almost gentle, but there was a darkness to them, a malevolence that sent chills down his spine. They called his name, their tones filled with a strange familiarity, as if they had known him long before he had ever stepped foot in this place. Jack, come to us. He tried to resist the pull of the voices, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping his mind clear. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the silence with their haunting melody. They spoke of secrets hidden in the forest, of answers waiting for him if he would only listen. The temptation was strong, a lure that tugged at the edge of his mind, coaxing him to surrender, to let go of the fear that gnawed at him. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the voices had woven themselves into his mind, wrapping around his senses like a shroud. He could feel them in every breath, every heartbeat, a constant presence that pressed in on him, urging him deeper into the forest, into the unknown. From the loops of the forest. After hours, or was it days, Jack realized he was moving in circles. No matter which direction he chose, he always found himself back at the same spot, the same clearing with the same twisted trees. The snow-covered ground was unbroken, as though he hadn't taken a single step. It was as if the forest itself were folding in on him, bending space to trap him in an endless loop. He tried marking the trees with his knife, carving deep slashes into the bark, but each time he returned, the marks were gone, erased as though the forest had healed itself, covering his tracks with fresh snow. Desperation clawed at him as he began to run, his heart pounding as he tried to break free from the invisible chains that bound him. But no matter how far he ran, he always ended up back in the same place, trapped in the same nightmare. The forest seemed to mock him, its silence thick with a quiet, malevolent intelligence. He could feel its eyes on him, the trees watching his every move, as though they were part of a vast living entity that stretched out beyond his comprehension. It was as if the forest itself were alive, a sentient being that had claimed him as its own, weaving him into its endless tapestry of shadows and snow. The cabin revisited. Finally, in a moment of sheer exhaustion, he stumbled into a clearing and found himself standing before a small, dilapidated cabin. It was the same cabin he'd found before, but it looked different now, more decayed, as though years had passed since he'd last seen it. The wood was darkened, rotting, the windows broken and filled with ice. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind, inviting him inside. Jack's heart pounded as he approached the cabin, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee from this place and never return. But he was drawn to it, compelled by some invisible force that urged him forward, pulling him into the heart of the darkness. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, a scent that clung to his skin, filling his lungs with each breath. Shadows flickered along the walls, moving with a life of their own, dancing in time with the whispers that filled the air. He made his way to the center of the room, where a single worn chair sat in the dim light. The walls were covered in scratches, strange symbols carved into the wood with a frantic hand. They spiraled around the room, forming patterns that twisted and turned, creating a dizzying effect that made his head spin. And then, in the dim light, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure seated in the chair, slumped over, its features hidden in shadow. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat as he reached out a trembling hand. But as he touched the figure, it crumbled into dust, disintegrating beneath his touch, leaving only an empty chair and a faint, lingering scent of decay. Lost memories. The longer Jack remained in the forest, the more his memories began to slip away. Faces, names, moments that had once been clear and vivid now felt distant, blurred, as though they belonged to someone else. He couldn't remember why he had come here, what he had hoped to find. He couldn't remember his own past, his own life beyond the forest. It was as if the forest were consuming him, devouring his identity piece by piece, leaving only an empty shell. He tried to hold on to his memories, to keep them close, but they slipped through his fingers like sand, fading into the shadows that surrounded him. The forest filled the void, replacing his memories with its own darkness, its own whispers, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the forest began. Prunty. And the figure in the snow. As he wandered through the endless snow, Jack saw a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and thin, shrouded in darkness, its form shifting and flickering, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. The figure seemed to watch him, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He called out, his voice breaking the silence, but the figure didn't respond. It only stood there, silent and still, a ghostly presence that filled the air with a sense of foreboding. He took a step toward it, his heart pounding, but as he approached, The figure vanished, dissolving into the mist, leaving only the faint imprint of footprints in the snow. He knelt down, staring at the prints, his mind racing with questions. The prints were fresh, the snow disturbed, yet there was no sign of the figure, no indication of where it had gone. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker, deeper, as though they were reaching out to him, pulling him into their depths. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, suffocating him, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The frozen watches. As he continued through the forest, he came upon a small mound in the snow, half buried under a layer of frost. He brushed away the snow, his heart sinking as he saw what lay beneath. A collection of watches, each one frozen, its hands stopped at different times. Some were old and rusted, others new, their glass faces cracked and covered in ice. He picked one up, staring at the frozen hands, the cold metal biting into his skin. The watch felt heavy, as though it held some dark secret, some piece of the past that had been forgotten. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange connection to it, a sense of familiarity that filled him with a sense of unease. He dropped the watch, letting it fall back into the snow, and continued on, his thoughts clouded by confusion and fear. The watches felt like a message, a reminder that time held no meaning here, that he was trapped in a place where the past and the present were one and the same. The statidwan pipa, the murmuring stream. He followed a faint sound, the trickling of water, and soon found himself standing beside a small frozen stream. The ice was thin, cracked in places, and he could see dark shapes moving beneath the surface, their forms distorted and shifting as they drifted through the water. He knelt beside the stream, staring into the depths, and saw faces staring back at him, ghostly, pale, their eyes empty and hollow. The faces shifted and changed, morphing into people he didn't recognize, their expressions filled with sorrow and despair. He felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though he had seen these faces before, though he couldn't remember where or when. The water seemed to whisper to him, its voice soft and mournful, filling his mind with a sense of loss that he couldn't explain. He reached out, touching the ice, and felt a shock of cold that jolted through his body, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He stood up, backing away from the stream, the whispers fading as he turned his back on the water. But he could still feel the weight of the faces, the sorrow that filled their hollow eyes, lingering in his mind like a shadow. 4. The final descent. As night fell, Jack found himself standing at the edge of a deep ravine, the darkness stretching out before him like a vast empty void. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet smell that clung to his skin, filling his lungs with each breath. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, a force that seemed to pull him toward the edge, urging him to step forward, to let go of the fear that bound him. He took a step closer, his mind clouded by a strange, dreamlike haze. He could feel the whispers filling his mind, their voices blending together in a haunting melody that filled him with a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of his fate. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness wash over him, and took another step, his foot slipping over the edge, the ground giving way beneath him. And as he fell, he felt a strange sense of relief, a release from the fear that had haunted him, a final descent into the heart of the forest. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole, and he knew that he had become part of the forest, another lost soul claimed by the shadows, another whisper in the endless night. Chapter 7. The Wendigo's Call. The air was still, thick with a biting cold that seemed to pierce Jack's very bones. The events of the past few days were a blur, fragmented memories of shadowy figures, voices in the snow, and an overwhelming sense that he was walking in circles. He no longer felt sure of where he was, or even who he was. The whispers, the lost time, the endless expanse of snow and shadow had eroded his sense of reality, leaving him adrift in a waking nightmare. As he trudged through the snow, a thought began to claw its way into his mind. A story he had read before coming to Yakutia, one that had felt like little more than myth at the time. The tale of the Wendigo, a creature of the wild, a spirit of hunger and darkness, cursed to wander the endless cold, consuming any lost soul it came across. The creature's insatiable appetite was said to warp the minds of its victims, driving them mad with visions, leading them into the depths of the wilderness from which they would never return. The thought was absurd, he told himself, just another folk tale. But now, with each step he took, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the forest itself were haunted by an ancient presence, a force that had watched him from the moment he entered its icy depths. The marked trees. As he walked, he began to notice strange carvings on the trees, faint and worn by time but unmistakable. The symbols were crude, scratched deeply into the bark with what looked like jagged lines that spiraled inward, forming intricate, unsettling patterns. They were marks of warning, of warding off evil, symbols he recognized from stories of the native Yakut people, marks meant to protect against the Wendigo. He paused, running his fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the rough texture of the bark beneath his gloved hand. The marks seemed to pulse under his touch, a faint warmth emanating from them, as though they held some hidden power. But the warmth was fleeting, quickly replaced by an icy chill that seeped into his skin, filling him with a sense of foreboding. The symbols were everywhere, carved into nearly every tree he passed, creating a maze of warnings that led him deeper into the forest. Each mark seemed to echo with the same message, a silent scream that warned him to turn back. But Jack felt something drawing him forward, pulling him toward an unknown destination, as if an invisible thread were leading him into the heart of the darkness. The call of the Wendigo. The air grew colder, and soon a faint, almost imperceptible sound began to drift through the trees. A low, mournful cry that seemed to vibrate with a chilling resonance. It was unlike anything Jack had ever heard, a sound that stirred something primal within him, a fear so deep that it sent shivers down his spine. The sound was distant, yet it filled the forest, echoing through the trees, wrapping around him like a vice. He stopped, his breath visible in the frigid air, listening as the sound grew louder, taking on a distinct tone that sent his heart racing. It was a voice, soft and mournful, calling his name in a haunting whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "Jack, come closer." The voice was gentle, almost inviting, but there was something twisted beneath it, a hunger that lurked within its depths. It filled his mind, clouding his thoughts, eroding his resolve. He tried to resist, to turn away, but the voice held him captive, drawing him forward with an irresistible pull. With each step he took, the voice grew louder, until it was all he could hear, a symphony of despair and longing that filled his mind, drowning out his own thoughts. He was no longer in control, no longer moving by his own will. The forest was guiding him, leading him towards something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. And the circle of bones. The trees began to thin, and Jack found himself stepping into a small clearing, the snow-covered ground marked with a strange circular pattern. Bones, bleached white by the cold, lay scattered across the snow, forming a rough circle around the clearing. They were old, brittle, their edges worn smooth by time, but they held a strange, haunting beauty, a reminder of lives lost to the unforgiving wilderness. In the center of the clearing stood a crude altar, a mound of stones piled high, topped with more bones, deer antlers, bear skulls, the remains of animals that had once roamed these woods. But there were other bones too, smaller, human in shape, their presence filling him with a sense of dread that made his skin crawl. The altar seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a power that radiated from it, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together in a haunting melody that echoed through the clearing, filling him with an overwhelming sense of despair. He wanted to turn back, to flee from this place, but his feet remained rooted to the ground, held in place by an invisible force that seemed to bind him to the clearing. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, a presence that watched from the shadows, waiting for him to make a move. Visions of the past. As he stood there, frozen in place, visions began to fill his mind. Images of people who had come before him, drawn into the forest by the same call, the same pull that had brought him here. He saw their faces, their expressions twisted with fear and despair, their eyes hollow and empty, as though their souls had been drained from their bodies, leaving only a shell behind. He saw them wandering through the forest, lost and alone, their footsteps weaving a path that led them in endless circles, always returning to the same spot, the same clearing. He saw them standing before the altar, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the bones that lay scattered around them. And then he saw the Wendigo. It was tall, its body thin and emaciated, its limbs long and twisted, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, a hunger that filled the darkness, a void that seemed to reach out, pulling everything around it into its depths. It moved with an unnatural grace, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear that radiated from its prey. The Wendigo reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, brushing against the faces of those who stood before it. And as it touched them, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies contorting as though they were being consumed from within. Jack felt a cold, sickening fear rise within him as he watched, his mind reeling with horror. He wanted to turn away, to close his eyes, but the vision held him captive, forcing him to watch as the Wendigo fed, as it claimed the souls of those who had come before him. At the mark of the forest, when the vision faded, Jack found himself on his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his body trembling with fear. He looked down, his hand resting on something cold and hard, and saw that he was clutching a bone, its surface smooth and polished, as though it had been worn down by years of exposure to the elements. He dropped the bone, scrambling back, his heart pounding as he stared at the altar. The bones scattered across the snow, the dark energy that radiated from the clearing. He could feel the presence of the Wendigo, a silent, unyielding force that filled the forest, binding him to this place, marking him as its own. The symbols carved into the trees seemed to pulse with a faint light, their shapes twisting and shifting, forming patterns that filled his mind with a sense of dread. He could feel them burning into his skin, branding him with the mark of the forest, a mark that tied him to the Wendigo, to the darkness that lurked within the trees. He tried to stand, his legs shaking, his body weak, but the mark held him in place, a weight that pressed down on him, filling him with a sense of hopelessness, of despair. He was no longer his own. He was part of the forest now, a piece of the darkness that stretched out beyond the trees, a soul bound to the Wendigo's call. A voice from the shadows. As he struggled against the mark, a voice broke through the silence, soft and mournful, filled with a sorrow that made his heart ache. "You cannot escape, Jack. The forest has claimed you." The voice was familiar, a memory that seemed to drift from the depths of his mind, a voice that he had heard before but couldn't place. He turned, searching for the source, but there was no one there, only shadows that stretched out beyond the trees, watching, waiting. "You are part of this place now," the voice continued, its tone filled with a quiet, haunting finality. "You belong to the forest, to the darkness. The Wendigo's call cannot be denied." Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek, a single drop of warmth in the endless cold. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but he knew that it was pointless. The forest had claimed him, and there was no escape, no salvation. The shadows closed in around him, their presence filling the air with a suffocating weight, a darkness that wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the forest, into the depths of the Wendigo's call. At the embrace of the forest. As the shadows consumed him, Jack felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of his fate. The fear, the despair, the hopelessness, all of it faded away, replaced by a calm that filled him with a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. He was part of the forest now, a piece of the darkness, a soul bound to the Wendigo's call. He could feel the hunger that filled the forest, a hunger that stretched out beyond the trees, reaching into the depths of his being, consuming him from within. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness, letting it wash over him, filling him with a sense of completeness, of unity. He was no longer alone, no longer lost. He was part of something greater, something ancient, something eternal. And as he slipped into the shadows, he knew that he would never leave, that he would wander the forest forever, a soul bound to the Wendigo's call, a whisper in the endless night. The forest was silent once more, the clearing empty, the bones scattered across the snow, waiting for the next lost soul to answer the call of the Wendigo. Chapter 8. The Frozen Graveyard. Jack's steps were heavy, his thoughts drifting as he walked through the endless expanse of snow. He no longer felt the bite of the cold, or the ache in his legs. It was as though his body had become numb, his senses dulled. Time had become meaningless in the forest. He could no longer remember how long he had been wandering, or what he had been searching for. All that remained was the pull, the invisible force that guided him deeper into the heart of the wilderness, whispering promises of answers that lay just beyond his reach. The wind stirred the snow around him, a soft and almost comforting lull that wrapped him in a strange, dreamlike haze. His mind was fogged, filled with memories that no longer felt like his own, visions of places and faces that faded like smoke the moment he tried to focus on them. The forest had become his world, its shadows and silence his only companions. The distant call of the Wendigo no longer filled him with terror. It had become a part of him, a constant murmur in the back of his mind, like a heartbeat that pulsed in time with his own. As he trudged through the snow, his eyes fixed on the ground before him, he noticed something strange. A mound, barely visible under the snow, its shape unnatural, out of place in the wild landscape. He stopped, staring at it, a sense of unease stirring within him. It was a grave. Estanci Carprafamum, the first grave. Jack knelt down, brushing away the snow to reveal a small, weathered stone, its surface rough and unmarked, as though it had been placed here long ago. The stone was cold, colder than the surrounding air, as if it held within it the chill of countless winters. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the texture of the stone beneath his gloves, a strange sense of reverence filling him. The grave was simple, unadorned, a lone marker in the vast expanse of snow. There was no name, no inscription, nothing to tell him who lay buried here, or how they had come to rest in this desolate place. But as he knelt beside it, he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, a weight that pressed down on him, filling him with a sorrow that he couldn't explain. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the landscape, and saw more mounds, faint outlines in the snow, stretching out in every direction. The forest floor was dotted with them, a silent graveyard hidden beneath the snow, the final resting place of souls claimed by the forest's cold embrace. For the silent testimony, Jack rose, his eyes lingering on the graves as he made his way through the frozen graveyard. Each step felt heavy, as though he were walking through a place of reverence, a hallowed ground that held the memories of those who had come before him. He could almost feel their presence, a faint echo of lives that had been lost, each one a story left unfinished, a journey cut short by the forest's unyielding grip. As he walked, he noticed small trinkets and objects scattered among the graves, personal items left behind, tokens of lives once lived. There were broken compasses, their needles frozen in place, watches with cracked faces, their hands stopped at different times, as though marking the moments their owners had succumbed to the forest's pull. A tarnished locket lay half buried in the snow, its chain twisted, its clasp broken, as if torn from someone's neck in a final moment of despair. Each item told a story, a silent testament to the lives that had ended here. He picked up a small rusted pocket knife, its blade dull and chipped, and felt a strange connection to it, as though he could sense the person who had once carried it, their hopes, their fears, their last desperate moments before they had been claimed by the forest. The graveyard stretched on, a vast, silent landscape of snow and shadows, each grave a reminder of the forest's dark history, a story etched into the earth itself. Jack felt as though he were walking through the remnants of a forgotten past, a place where time had ceased to exist, where the boundaries between life and death had blurred. Amasan should the forgotten names. As he wandered through the graves, Jack began to hear whispers, faint voices that drifted through the air, filling the silence with a soft, mournful melody. The voices were low, their tones filled with sorrow, as though they were calling out from beyond the veil, reaching out to him, begging him to remember them. Remember us! The words echoed in his mind, a haunting plea that sent chills down his spine. He tried to ignore them, to push them from his thoughts, but the voices grew louder, their tones filled with a desperation that tugged at his heart. He could feel their sadness, their loneliness, a weight that pressed down on him, filling him with a sense of guilt, as though he were responsible for their suffering. He looked around, his eyes scanning the graves, and for a moment, he thought he saw faces in the shadows, faint and ghostly, their eyes hollow and empty, filled with a longing that tore at his soul. The faces shifted and changed, blending together, becoming one with the forest, their presence a constant reminder of the lives that had been lost, the names that had been forgotten. Jack closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voices, but they persisted, filling his mind with their sorrow, their despair. He felt as though he were drowning in their memories, sinking into a darkness that had no end, a void that stretched out beyond his understanding. The symbolic markers. As he moved deeper into the graveyard, Jack noticed that some of the graves were marked with symbols, crude carvings etched into stones, tree trunks, and even the frozen ground itself. The symbols were unlike anything he had ever seen, their shapes twisted and distorted, filled with a strange, unsettling power. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a force that radiated from the earth, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. He knelt beside one of the symbols, tracing its lines with his fingers, feeling the cold, rough texture of the stone beneath his touch. The symbol seemed to come alive under his touch, its lines shifting and twisting, forming patterns that filled his mind with visions of darkness, of shadows that stretched out beyond the trees, of a hunger that could never be sated. He felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct that told him to run, to flee from this place and never look back. But the forest held him in its grip, binding him to the graves, to the memories that lingered here, a silent witness to the lives that had been lost. The symbols were markers, he realized, a language of the forest, a code that only those who had been claimed by its darkness could understand. They were a warning, a message left behind by the souls who had come before him, a plea for anyone who found this place to turn back before it was too late. But Jack knew that there was no turning back, no escape from the forest's pull. He was bound to this place, a part of its darkness, a soul marked by its hunger, destined to wander its depths for eternity. Of the shadow of the Wendigo. As he stood among the graves, a chill ran down his spine, a feeling of dread that filled him with an overwhelming sense of terror. He could feel a presence behind him, a dark shadow that loomed over him, its gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he looked into the eyes of the Wendigo. The creature was tall, its body thin and emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones, as though it had been starved for centuries. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, filled with a hunger that seemed to burn with an intensity that defied explanation. Its mouth was twisted into a cruel smile, its teeth sharp and gleaming, as though it were savoring the fear that radiated from him. Jack felt his body freeze, his breath catching in his throat as the Wendigo took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, each step filling the air with a sense of inevitability. He could feel its hunger, a void that stretched out beyond the forest, a darkness that devoured everything in its path. The Wendigo stopped, its gaze fixed on him, and in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "Your soul is mine." The words echoed through the graveyard, filling the air with a sense of finality, a promise that there was no escape, no salvation. Jack felt his mind unraveling, his thoughts slipping away, as though the Wendigo were pulling him into its darkness, devouring his very essence. He tried to fight, to hold on to his memories, his sense of self, but the darkness was too strong, a force that overwhelmed him, drowning him in its depths. And the descent into darkness. As the Wendigo closed in, Jack felt himself slipping, his mind falling into a void that stretched out beyond the graveyard, beyond the forest, into a place of endless night. He could feel the lives of those who had come before him, their souls bound to the darkness, their memories lost, their identities erased. He was no longer himself. He was part of the forest, a piece of its hunger, a shadow that would wander its depths for eternity. The faces of the dead filled his mind, their eyes hollow, their voices silent, as they reached out to him, welcoming him into their ranks. And as he slipped into the shadows, he felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of his fate. He was no longer alone. He was part of something greater, something ancient, something eternal. The graveyard lay silent once more, the snow covering the graves, the symbols etched into the stones fading with time, waiting for the next lost soul to find its way into the forest's cold embrace. And as the night closed in, the Wendigo's call echoed through the trees, a haunting melody that filled the air with a sense of despair, a reminder that the forest's hunger would never be sated. And Jack was gone. Another soul lost to the shadows, another whisper in the endless night. Chapter 9. The Frozen Heart. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as Jack wandered deeper into the heart of the forest. His feet moved through the snow, each step heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him down. The forest had become a maze, a labyrinth of shadow and silence, where the trees grew closer with each passing step, their skeletal branches twisting like grasping hands. The cold had seeped into his bones, yet it wasn't the temperature that made his skin crawl. It was the suffocating silence, the feeling of being surrounded by unseen eyes, the persistent awareness that something was watching him from just beyond his sight. He hadn't meant to come back here. This was the place where everything had started. The whispers, the footprints in the snow, the haunting figures that seemed to materialize from the very air itself. Yet here he was again, drawn into the heart of the forest, as though some invisible force had a claim on him, as if the trees themselves had wrapped him in their grasp, tightening their hold with each step he took. He had lost track of time. Days seemed to blend together now, moments slipping away like the snow that fell endlessly from the darkened sky. Even his thoughts felt distant, fragmented, as if they were being torn apart by the constant hum of the forest, the whispers that had become a part of him, the cold grip that held his mind in a vice. The disappearing path. Every turn he made, every step he took, led him deeper into the unknown, the forest stretching out before him in endless stretches of white and black. The snow was thick, the ground uneven, and Jack had long since abandoned any hope of finding his way back to civilization. He had forgotten what it was like to see another human face, to hear the sound of a voice that wasn't his own. The trees had become familiar, yet utterly alien, as if they were alive, shifting, bending to his will. Or was it his will at all? He felt as if he were being guided, nudged towards something just out of reach. The path ahead was never clear, and the footprints he had left behind in the snow were already fading, vanishing into the swirling white like they had never been there at all. He couldn't tell if he was walking forward or if he was retracing his steps, caught in a loop that only the forest understood. And then, just as he thought he could walk no further, he saw it. The clearing. And the clearing of echoes. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of his mind. The clearing stretched before him, a place untouched by the dense trees that surrounded him. The air here was strangely warm, a sharp contrast to the biting cold that had clung to him in the forest. The snow here was undisturbed, pristine, as though no one had set foot here in years, or perhaps centuries. Jack stepped forward cautiously, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his heartbeat thumping in his chest like a drum. The clearing was empty, silent, save for the faint whisper of the wind. There was no sign of life, no birds in the trees, no rustling of leaves. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that felt as though it was watching him. As he moved deeper into the clearing, his eyes caught something, small, almost insignificant, yet impossibly out of place. A figure, standing at the far edge, facing him. It was a silhouette, unmoving, still as stone, yet Jack could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on him, cold and unblinking. The face in the snow. The figure stood motionless, a dark shape against the endless white. Jack's heart raced as he approached, his legs heavy, his body unwilling to move. The closer he got, the clearer the figure became. Tall, gaunt, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally from its body. It wore tattered clothes, covered in snow, but it was not the clothes that drew Jack's attention. It was its face. The face was hollow, pale, a ghostly mask that stared back at him with hollow eyes, empty and unseeing. Its mouth was cracked open in a grotesque grin, its teeth jagged and sharp, a smile that was more a sneer of hunger than anything resembling warmth. Jack froze, unable to tear his eyes away. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge him, but its presence seemed to grow stronger, heavier, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The air grew colder, the wind whipping around him, and the clearing that had once felt welcoming now seemed to close in on him, the darkness creeping closer. Then, the figure's mouth moved. A sound, low, guttural, escaped, a whisper that scraped at Jack's mind like fingernails against glass. "Join us!" The circle of silence. Jack stumbled back, his legs weak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He spun around, his eyes searching for any sign of an escape, but the clearing had changed. What had once been an open space now felt like a trap. The trees that had once encircled it now closing in, their branches bending as if to seal him inside. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a strange, maddening hunger. He turned back to the figure, his body moving against his will, drawn to it as though some invisible thread tied him to it. The figure remained still, its hollow eyes never leaving him, but the voice, soft, insistent, like the wind, continued to call to him. "Join us, Jack. You are one of us." Jack's feet moved of their own accord, as if he were no longer in control of his body. He tried to fight, to push against the pull, but it was useless. The voice filled him, consumed him, like the cold, filling every part of his being with its eerie promise. He reached the figure, standing before it, trembling as its eyes met his. The air around him thickened, the cold pressing in like a suffocating weight. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirl of fear and confusion. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, consuming his thoughts, erasing his will, until there was nothing left but the whispers, nothing but the hunger. And then, the figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing his cheek. The touch was cold, like ice, and Jack shuddered as its hand slid down his face, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. His body trembled, but he couldn't pull away. The unseen chains. The voice spoke again, its tone now deeper, more insistent, as though it was coming from all around him, filling the air with its dark promise. "You are already one of us, Jack. The forest has claimed you. The Wendigo calls to you." Jack's thoughts fragmented, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The forest, the Wendigo, it was all part of the same thing, a dark, ancient force that had been here long before him, that would remain long after he was gone. He felt the weight of its presence, a force older than time itself, reaching out, pulling him into its depths. He could feel it now, the hunger, the unyielding need that filled the air, the same hunger that had driven the others into madness. The whispers, the cold, the empty eyes, they were all part of it, a twisted web that ensnared all who came too close. And now, it was his turn. His knees buckled, and he fell to the snow, the weight of the forest pressing down on him, its voice filling his mind. The cold seeped into his bones, and he could feel himself being pulled into the earth, as though the forest itself was swallowing him whole. The hunger was there, a gnawing emptiness that filled him from the inside out. The figure loomed over him, its hands outstretched, its fingers brushing his face once more. "You belong here now, Jack. The forest has claimed you." The Wendigo's embrace. The air around him thickened, the wind howling like the cries of the lost, and then the darkness closed in. Jack's body felt light, weightless, as though he were being lifted into the air, pulled by some unseen force, drawn into the depths of the forest. He could feel the hunger gnawing at his soul, an unrelenting emptiness that reached deep inside him, consuming everything he was. The figure dissolved into the shadows, its presence lingering in the air, a promise that he was now part of the forest, part of its endless hunger. The trees around him shifted, their branches creaking as though they were alive, reaching out to claim him. The whispers swirled around him, their voices rising in a cacophony of sound, a choir of the lost, each one begging for release, each one consumed by the Wendigo's call. And then he saw it. The Wendigo, tall and emaciated, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It moved toward him, slow and deliberate, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its fingers grasping at the air. Its hunger was palpable, a force that filled the very air, reaching out to claim him, to drag him into the darkness. It was the Wendigo's hunger, a void that could never be filled, an eternal longing that devoured everything in its path. And now, Jack was part of it. He could feel the hunger inside him, a gnawing emptiness that had taken root in his soul, spreading like a cancer. He tried to scream, to fight back, but there was no escape. The forest had claimed him, and the Wendigo's call had pulled him into its depths, a part of the darkness, a whisper in the endless night. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the Wendigo's glowing eyes, fixed on him, watching him as he was swallowed whole by the hunger of the empty place. When the darkness faded, Jack was gone. The clearing was still, the snow undisturbed, save for the marks left by the Wendigo's passing. The wind howled through the trees, and the silence that followed was thick, heavy, like a weight pressing down on the land. The forest remained, eternal, its hunger never ceasing, its call never ending. And as the wind whispered through the trees, it carried with it the echoes of those who had come before, their voices lost to the darkness, their souls claimed by the Wendigo. Another whisper joined the chorus, faint but growing stronger, as Jack's soul became part of the forest. Another lost soul drawn into the eternal night. And the Wendigo waited, its hunger endless, its call never ceasing, for the next soul to wander into the forest, to answer the call, to be consumed by the dark hunger that lay at the heart of the wilderness. And the forest would continue, as it always had, waiting, watching, and calling. Chapter 10. The Final Transmission. Jack's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the camera, the lens frozen, unmoving in his hands. The camera had once been his means of connection to the outside world, a way of documenting the terrifying beauty of the wilderness and its chilling secrets. But now, in the heart of the Yakutian forest, the camera had become something else. It was his final lifeline, the last thread that bound him to the memories of who he had been before the forest swallowed him whole. The forest had changed him, or perhaps it had simply revealed something about him that he hadn't wanted to see. His thoughts were a tangled mess, disconnected and disjointed, like the twisted branches of the trees that loomed around him. His heart raced, his breath shallow, as he sat alone in the small cabin he had found the day before. The cold walls pressing in on him, the snow swirling outside. The camera was on, recording, though the red light blinked dully, as if it too had given up hope. Jack turned it on and off again, but the lens remained frozen. The camera had long since lost its purpose. There was no one left to share his story with. The voices, the whispers that had been haunting him for days, no longer felt distant. They had grown closer, their soft murmurs now laced with his own fear, reflecting in the hollow eyes of the cabin's walls. The Wendigo, the forest, the figures in the shadows. Everything had become one, a unified force that gnawed at his mind, devouring his thoughts, twisting his very soul. There was no escape. The trees had claimed him. The whispers had claimed him. And now the hunger had taken root in his chest. At the pull of the voices, Jack had tried to fight it. For as long as he could remember, he had tried to ignore the call, tried to outrun it. But the forest was relentless, its whispers now unmistakably familiar, now a part of his own heartbeat. They spoke to him in his sleep, coaxing him into the dark embrace of the woods. When he was awake, they followed him, their words wrapping themselves around his consciousness, leaving him breathless, as though he were drowning in them. "Come," they whispered. "Come and join us." He had come to the chilling realization that he could no longer tell where the voices of the forest ended and where his own thoughts began. It was as if the forest had seeped into his very being, eroding his will, leaving him as hollow as the trees that stood around him. Jack's breath hitched as he looked out the cabin window, staring at the thick wall of trees that surrounded him, their gnarled branches stretching upward like the fingers of some ancient, unseen god. His eyes darted around, as if expecting the shadows to move, expecting to see the faint outline of the Wendigo in the distance, waiting, watching. He hadn't seen it in days, but he knew it was still there, always just out of sight, its hunger forever present. And the abyss that calls the forest was always quiet, but there were moments, fleeting seconds, when the silence would break, when he could hear the soft rustle of something moving in the trees, the faintest sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. But when he looked, when he forced himself to look, the clearing would always be empty. Jack shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the voices, their insistent call, grew louder in his ears, a hum that resonated deep within his skull. The camera, still recording, captured the fleeting moments of his distress. His hands trembled, the lens shaking in his grip as he moved it to focus on the surrounding trees. The footage captured only shadows, distant shapes that seemed to distort in the dim light. Nothing concrete, nothing tangible. He reached for the journal he had kept since entering the wilderness, the pages filled with frantic scribbles, images of the things he had seen, the voices he had heard, the encounters he had endured. The ink was smudged in places, as if his hands had been too shaky to write, or as though the weight of his thoughts had pushed the ink into an incoherent blur. Jack stared at the final entry, the last words he had written before the whispers had consumed his mind completely. The forest. It watches. It listens. There is no leaving. The Wendigo is not a creature of flesh. It is the forest. It is time. The hunger has begun. It's in the trees. It's in me. Fading to black. A chill ran through him as he read his own words, feeling a rising wave of panic grip his chest. The hunger had settled in his stomach, a gnawing, unrelenting force that had taken over his body. His thoughts no longer belonged to him. They had been replaced by the forest's pulse, its heartbeat thumping softly in the distance, echoing in his mind. Jack glanced at the camera again. He could feel his own reflection in the glass, his face pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow. The longer he stared at himself, the more foreign his own features became, as if he were looking at a stranger, a man who had already been lost, already claimed by the forest. He placed the camera on the floor, his reflection now in the lens, the distortion of his face staring back at him with a kind of dreadful recognition. The Wendigo was not a creature of flesh and bone, but something older, something that had always been there, deep within the trees. It was not just a beast. It was an eternal force, an abyss that fed on the souls of those who ventured too close. The hunger was part of the land itself, woven into the roots of the trees, pulsing beneath the earth like the beating heart of the forest. The words of the journal echoed in his mind. It is time. The hunger has begun. Jack's hands shook violently as he stumbled to his feet, the room spinning around him. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, the presence of the Wendigo so near that he could almost smell its foul breath, feel its insatiable hunger creeping along his skin. He grabbed his coat, his gloves, and rushed outside. The cold bit into him instantly, but he didn't care. The darkness was closing in, the forest suffocating him, pulling him into its depths. His breath came in short bursts, his body moving on its own, no longer under his control. His legs carried him deeper into the woods, beyond the clearing, toward the shadows that seemed to breathe and shift. He heard the crunch of snow behind him, footsteps that didn't belong to him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. The trees were still, their dark shapes looming over him like sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching toward him. The air was thick with something primal, something ancient, and he felt it, something watching him, something waiting. The abyss of the Wendigo. The forest had swallowed him, consumed his soul, and now it was coming for him, pulling him into the void. He could feel the pull, the darkness stretching out to meet him. He wasn't running from the Wendigo anymore. He was running toward it, drawn by an invisible thread, the hunger calling his name, The whispers had reached a deafening crescendo in his mind, the voices now an overwhelming roar that filled every part of him. "Join us, Jack," they whispered. "It's too late." The cold air wrapped around him like a noose, and the darkness became a physical force, a weight that pressed against him, crushing him with the sheer force of its malevolent power. His legs faltered, and he stumbled, falling to the ground, his breath shallow and ragged. He was no longer alone. The Wendigo had arrived. Jack could feel its presence in the air around him, thick and suffocating. It was in the trees, in the shadows, in the very soil beneath him. It was the forest itself, ancient and eternal, and it was coming for him. The last thing Jack saw before the darkness consumed him was the eyes. The yellow, glowing eyes of the Wendigo, staring down at him with an intensity that sent a surge of terror through his heart. Its form was shifting, malleable, the shadows of the forest becoming one with its body, its limbs stretching and twisting unnaturally. He felt its cold breath on his skin, its hunger filling his mind, consuming his thoughts. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The Wendigo's laughter, a deep, hollow sound, filled the air around him, its voice reverberating through his skull. Jack's final thought before the abyss claimed him was a simple one. There is no escaping the Wendigo. There never was. The final transmission. The camera sat on the cold ground, recording, its lens focusing on the empty space before it. The shadows of the forest crept closer, dark shapes that seemed to grow with every passing second. The clearing was silent, the trees motionless, and the snow remained undisturbed. Then, as if responding to some unseen force, the camera's red light flickered, and the image on the lens blurred. A faint whisper, low and almost inaudible, escaped the speakers. "Jack!" The camera trembled slightly, and then, as the shadows around it deepened, the lens captured nothing but darkness. The red light went out, and the forest fell silent once more. Be for you from stand the end. The forest stood still, as it always had. Time continued its slow, unbroken march, though Jack was no more than a whisper, a shadow that had been claimed by the Wendigo's endless hunger. The cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echoes of his name, the last trace of a soul lost to the darkness of the Yakutian wilderness. The Wendigo waited, as it always had, its hunger eternal, its call never ending. And the forest stood, forever watching, forever waiting, for the next soul to wander into its depths. The endless night continued, with only silence left in its wake.